On 9 November 2019 in Yuendumu, Kumanjai Walker, a 19-year-old Walpuri Luritja teenager, was shot and killed by former Constable Zachary Rolfe, aged 28 years, who was in his 4th year of policing in the Northern Territory. Kumanjai's paternal side, Walker, is Walpuri and includes the communities of Yuendumu, Lajamanu, Willowa and Nirapi. Does it need to be closer? Kumanjai's paternal side, Walker, is Walpuri and includes the communities of Yuendumu, Lajamanu, Willowa and Nirapi. His maternal side, Lane, is Luritja and comes from the communities of Papunya, Hearthsbluff, Mount Liebig and Kintor. As an infant, he was adopted by Leanne Nakamara Oldfield, Brown. The male elders of the Brown family took him through ceremony near Yuendumu, and he was given Walpuri skin names of Yapanyanga and Jungaray. Kumanjai's passing is a tragedy for him and for those who knew and loved him. In this community, Kumanjai was a son, grandson, brother and cousin, nephew and partner. I am very sorry for your loss, and condolences have been expressed by the agencies who were represented at the inquest and many individual witnesses who were deeply affected by his passing. Today, I again acknowledge your pain and sorrow and pay my respects to all those who grieve him. Evidence in this inquest has been distressing to hear, particularly for those who loved Kumanjai. I acknowledge that participating in these proceedings has taken a toll on Kumanjai's family and this community. I appreciate the gracious way his family and all of you gave evidence, listened, bore witness, and patiently awaited these findings. Kumanjai's death and these proceedings have also had a profound impact on many people connected with the events of the day. That includes police, witnesses, Mr. Rolfe and his family, clinic staff and other service providers. I acknowledge that it has been hard for many of you and that the receipt of these findings may also cause distress. My task has been to find the truth as best I can about the circumstances of Kumanjai's passing. It would be a disservice to all who have played a part in these proceedings if I were to shy away now from speaking truthfully about the evidence I have heard. Today I sit in Yuendumu to deliver these findings in the community where Kumanjai passed away. The Coroner's Court of the Northern Territory recognises the importance of inquests being held where the critical events happened. Due to the scale of this inquest, it was not possible for it to be conducted in Yuendumu, but I accepted an invitation from the community to visit Yuendumu for 2 days during the inquest and again today to deliver these findings. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of Kumanjai's family, the Walpuri and Luritja people who live throughout the Central Desert and whose ancestors have occupied these lands for tens of thousands of years. I also acknowledge the Aranda people of Mbantua, Alice Springs, the traditional owners of the land where this court sat for the hearing of this inquest. The fatal shooting of a member of the public by a police officer is traumatic for all of those involved. When the individual who dies is an Aboriginal person, there is an added layer of anguish, given the history of Australia post-colonisation. As Coroner McGregor said in the recent Victorian inquest into the death of Veronica Nelson, when the passing of an Aboriginal person occurs in custody, it occurs on the continuum of the problematic relationship between Australian criminal justice systems and First Nations people. Over the past 50 years of policing in the Northern Territory, it has been very rare for a police officer to shoot a member of the public. And in modern policing, There are clear rules in place designed to protect the rights and freedoms of all citizens equally. Yet the history of the Northern Territory and many parts of our country includes the murder of Aboriginal people who occupied lands that were forcibly taken. Many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people feel the pain of that history. Warlpiri and Luritja ancestors lived on their country for many thousands of years, practising their laws and customs, and many are now living on far less habitable land, separated from traditional country and culture. The memory of the 1928 Coniston massacre, the last recorded state-sanctioned massacre of Aboriginal people, which occurred not far from Yuendamu, remains enormously significant today. Many stories are still told of who hid where and who was killed. Warren Williams, who was born 28 years after the massacre and was a grandfather to Kumanjai, said that his old uncle had put himself into a hollow and he got burnt out like a rabbit and he took off to Mount Theo, as others had done. Further, almost 30 years after the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, Aboriginal people are still heavily overrepresented in police and prison custody in the Northern Territory and throughout Australia, and in the numbers who die in custody. Given this history and the impact of intergenerational trauma, it is not surprising that the death of an Aboriginal person in custody is felt throughout the Territory and the nation. Aside from the goal of preventing another family from experiencing this type of loss, the broader injury to the wider community caused by a death in these circumstances is an important reason for a thorough inquest with clear findings and recommendations. It is my sincere hope that the handing down of these findings will help to prevent a similar tragedy. The complete findings are lengthy, over 600 pages. This is just a brief summary of some of the findings and recommendations. Nothing in the findings should be taken to mean that I think that police are not entitled to lawfully defend themselves against serious attacks. An important aim of these findings, however, is to make recommendations that reduce the risk of attacks upon police who perform a vital role in our community. Although much of this inquest reviewed formal documents, policies and the actions of others, I never lost sight of the fact that I was inquiring into the death of a person who lived, was loved, is missed and mourned. While Kumanjai's family members accept his frailties and vulnerabilities, they urge me to remember him for his humanity and to acknowledge the whole person they have lost. During the inquest, I received evidence to help me understand why Kumanjai responded in the way he did on 9 November 2019, and whether that type of behaviour can be better anticipated and avoided by police. In Chapter 2 of my findings, I've set out in some detail the family history for Kumanjai, including some of the challenges he had growing up in Yuendamu. Evidence suggests that from the age of around 13 years, Kumanjai engaged in substance abuse, including alcohol, petrol, solvent sniffing and cannabis. In early 2014, Kumanjai was identified as a high-risk youth by the Warlpiri Youth Development Aboriginal Corporation. Alongside families caring for Kumanjai, WIDAC developed an early plan, and Kumanjai participated in the 4-week Mount Theo diversion program, which took children and young people to the outstation at Mount Theo. They were well looked after and guided by elders and a youth worker or counsellor, and he did well there. I have little doubt that Kumanjai's behavioural problems as a teenager and young adult stem from his exposure to alcohol in utero and the trauma he experienced as a young child, largely because of his exposure to violence, alcohol and neglect. There is a growing body of evidence about the long-term negative impact on children from exposure to trauma, particularly domestic family violence, during their formative years. Kerry-Ann Chilvers worked with Kumanjai for 7 years between 2013 and 2019, first as a social worker and then as his psychologist. She explained that Kumanjai had no internal body awareness. In trauma-related terms, this is also called dissociation. The professional opinion of Miss Chilvers is that as a result of the high level of dissociation that Kumanjai experienced, he had no capacity for self-regulation. The expert opinion of Miss Chilvers provides me with significant insight into the actions of Kumanjai on 6 and 9 November 2019. It is this type of information that could and should inform the risk assessment planning that police do for an arrest of someone like Kumanjai. Because of his disabilities, Kumanjai could not cope at school. He was arrested for property crime and domestic violence offences. Local police officer Sergeant Anne Jolly was distressed by his circumstances and tried to help him. From the ages of 13 to 18, Kumanjai spent a considerable period of time in juvenile detention or under some restraint, such as bail or subject to a court order. On average, for more than half of each year, Kumanjai was under some form of restraint. In November 2017, the Royal Commission into the Protection and Detention of Children in the Northern Territory delivered its final report on the detention of children at Darwin's Dondale and the Alice Springs Youth Detention Centres. I heard expert evidence that the way to assist Kumanjai to function well was to provide him with safe boundaries, security and culturally connected comfort, such as he received in the SevGen and Mount Theo programs. The descriptions of the two detention centres where Kumanjai was held are not consistent with the goals of rehabilitation, healing or reducing crime. Given his ongoing level of reoffending, it seems very clear that detention neither deterred nor rehabilitated Kumanjai, and his isolation from family and community likely had negative effects on his chances for rehabilitation. On this, I heard these closing oral submissions of the Parumperu Committee. Kumanjai spent much time in custody as a teenager, and as he got older, he remained caught up in the justice system, regularly being detained. So, what lessons have we learnt about rigid systems of punishment where the process obscures the purpose? And so, with sadness and with anger, our clients ask us, what has Kumanjai's trajectory taught us? Who is learning from these failings? To assist me to develop meaningful recommendations, I heard evidence about what worked and didn't work to assist Kumanjai, what services are available in Yuendamu to assist youth with complex developmental trauma and behavioural issues, and the current police training in trauma and cultural competency. The life experiences of Mr. Rolfe are far removed from those of Kumanjai, the young man he killed during the ill-fated arrest on 9 November 2019. That is part of the reason why neither understood why or how the other would react that day. I acknowledge that Mr. Rolfe has been through a stressful periods following the death of Kumanjai. I have no doubt that the court proceedings and surrounding events have been much more than tough on him and his family. I took into account the strain that someone in his circumstances would be under and have carefully considered favourable evidence concerning his abilities and positive attributes identified by some of his supervisors. Mr. Rolfe, who was represented by a team of extremely experienced counsel, was afforded every opportunity to participate in this inquest and to present his version of events fully and fairly. I have taken into account that Mr. Rolfe was a junior police officer with relatively limited experience, and that he and other officers were tasked with difficult jobs and had a relentless workload that was sometimes traumatic and confronting. Nevertheless, I received a substantial body of evidence that plainly reveals examples of Mr. Rolfe's conduct, including dishonesty, and attitudes that reflect very poorly on him and in a way that is relevant to my assessment of the events of 9 November. Chapters 3 and 4 outline in a general or thematic way my findings regarding Mr. Rolfe's short time as a police officer, and I will now make some brief observations regarding the relevance of those findings to my investigation of the events of 9 November 2019. To understand the actions of Mr. Rolfe on 9 November and to draft meaningful recommendations to prevent another death in similar circumstances, it was necessary to consider issues relating to Mr. Rolfe's background and the context of the events, and not merely conduct a narrow appraisal of the 3 days leading up to Kumanjayi's death. I heard evidence about some of Mr. Rolfe's attitudes that may have influenced why he made decisions to enter House 511 and conduct the flawed arrest on Kumanjayi in the manner that he did. Mr. Rolfe's text messages provided evidence of his derisive attitudes to female colleagues and some superiors, his frustration or contempt for more senior officers who had not earned his respect, his attraction to high adrenaline policing, and his contempt for bush cops or remote policing, all of which had the potential to increase the likelihood of a fatal encounter with Kumanjayi. For reasons outlined in my findings, I am comfortably satisfied that these unsavoury views and attitudes were consciously or unconsciously embedded in the decisions Mr. Rolfe made on 9 November 2019. Despite the focus on issues of race and racism in media reporting of the inquest did not conduct a wide-ranging inquiry into racism. Instead, it received a modest amount of evidence about racism while investigating the potential causes and relevant circumstances of Kumanjayi's death. In my findings, I have carefully set out what the evidence was and why it was relevant. The purpose of receiving this evidence was to investigate whether Mr. Rolfe held racist views, what the consequence of those views might have been for his conduct on 9 November 2019, why he might have held those views, and how they might be prevented in the future. If Mr. Rolfe held racist attitudes, I was concerned to understand whether his conduct on 9 November 2019 in an Aboriginal community and towards the young Aboriginal man he shot and killed was influenced by that racism in a way that increased the likelihood of death. It is helpful to briefly say something about why racist attitudes might develop in a Northern Territory police officer and what the evidence concerning racism was. A single coroner in a single inquest is not well equipped to definitively explain why racism might develop in a young police officer like Mr. Rolfe, or in a complex work environment like the Alice Springs Police Station. And in this inquest, the evidence focused more on whether racism existed rather than why it might exist. However, in the findings, I provide some possible explanations about why racism might develop. I will mention just one of them now. In a station like the Alice Springs Police Station, the junior frontline police are overwhelmingly interacting with Aboriginal people, and overwhelmingly these policing interactions are sadly negative and may be traumatising for the officers involved. I refer, for example, to police attending incidents of domestic violence, police witnessing other trauma such as road crashes, and police themselves being on the receiving end of racist comments during the course of their duties. Mr. Bruce Van Heften, a psychologist with over 20 years' experience working with frontline services, explained that high-frequency exposure to trauma and distressing events could give rise to maladaptive responses such as sensitisation and desensitisation. Sensitisation may occur when a police officer is repeatedly exposed to traumatising behaviours by members of a particular cohort, such as a particular race, in this case Aboriginal persons. Repeated exposure to negative interactions may cause a police officer to develop a psychological bias, which increases the likelihood that officers will anticipate a negative interaction when dealing with that group. Concerning desensitisation, Mr. Van Heften explained that repeated exposure to trauma, for instance, the aftermath of domestic violence, combined with a sense of helplessness experienced by an officer who is powerless to address the underlying causes of that violence, may create a tension between the officer's own values and the tasks or situations that they have been placed in. The upshot is that a police officer's repeat exposure to negative interactions with and exposure to trauma from policing Aboriginal persons may give rise to generalised negative attitudes about those persons that help to explain text messages in which officers express frustration in racist terms with Aboriginal complainants or suspects. In evidence, one police officer insightfully drew a connection between his repeat exposure to domestic violence and his own racist behaviour. He said that desensitivity is a very real thing and had a part to play in diminishing his moral code. That is why the NT police force must take steps through its training, supervision, culture and leadership to ensure racist attitudes do not develop, and if they do, they are identified and corrected and are not tolerated or condoned. Concerning racism, there was direct evidence of clearly racist comments made by Mr. Rolfe and between Mr. Rolfe and his superiors. In the lead up to Kumanjai's death, the telephone text messages that were typed by Mr. Rolfe and some of his colleagues contained extremely racist names and references to Aboriginal people. They are too hurtful to repeat now, but I have not shied away from using the exact language in my findings. In the messages, Aboriginality was equated with alcoholism and other antisocial behaviour. These messages were not just between junior officers, but included at least one sergeant who was Mr. Rolfe's direct supervisor. I received a modest amount of evidence concerning racism within Mr. Rolfe's work environment at the Alice Springs police station. Mr. Rolfe himself identified that the likelihood that someone will make racist comments or hold racist views increases in a context where racism is condoned or not actively discouraged. To be clear, many of the police officers who gave evidence to the inquest impressed me as curious and culturally sensitive officers who had dedicated their working lives to serving the largely Aboriginal communities they were tasked to police. They were not racist. Even so, I found that racist language and actions were not confined to Mr. Rolfe, and this was not a case of one bad apple. Instead, the evidence suggested that racist behaviour or language, although not uniform, was normalised within the Alice Springs police station during Mr. Rolfe's time there as a junior police officer. One source of evidence as to normalisation was from another probationary constable who was close to Mr. Rolfe during 2018. She said she heard derogatory terms about Aboriginal people while working at the Alice Springs police station. Initially, she was shocked by the language, but she also said that she became desensitised to it. She said that she did not raise it as a problem with her seniors because, as she explained, when superiors are using those words, it becomes normalised, and it had an impact on the whole culture of the workplace. She said the language was dehumanising. After objecting over a 2-year period to the inquest receiving evidence regarding racism, in February 2024, Mr. Rolfe himself gave evidence that racist language was normalised within his workplace. He also introduced evidence of the use of racist language in the NT police force more broadly. Mr. Rolfe introduced and pressed for the receipt of evidence regarding racism within the tactical response group. He said that he had interactions with the TRG and in that context heard racist language and learned of an annual TRG awards ceremony with offensive racist names. Although the existence of the awards and their racist origins were initially denied by senior NT police members, the evidence confirmed their racist origin and meaning. These so-called awards were grotesque examples of racism. The former Commissioner of Police, Michael Murphy, accepted that members of the TRG who were present over the decade when the so-called awards were handed out would have been aware of the awards, and in that context, the awards were not a secret. A significant number of those TRG members have moved on and up the ranks of the current NT police. Over the decade the awards were given, no complaint was ever made about them until they came to light as part of these inquest proceedings. Former Commissioner Murphy agreed that was a catastrophic failure of the Police Code of Conduct, which ostensibly prohibited discrimination, harassment, and specifically the displaying of racist or derogatory material, such as posters or cartoons. That no police member who knew of these awards reported them is, in my view, a clear evidence of entrenched systemic and structural racism within the NT police. In February 2022, former Commissioner Murphy effectively denied racism within the NT police when he said in a press conference, "I don't see those behaviours, I don't hear those comments." When he was interrogated about this answer in the course of his evidence, he conceded that this answer effectively gaslit members of the Aboriginal community who had experienced and complained of racism. He ultimately accepted on the record that racism in the NT police was not simply historic. He said, "It's recent, Your Honour." I'm comfortably satisfied that racist language was normalised within the Alice Springs Police Station during Mr. Rolfe's time there as a police officer. His racist messages were not mere aberrations. They were, at least in part, reflective of a work culture that tolerated racism. Having considered all the evidence, including Mr. Rolfe's explanations and justifications, I found that Mr. Rolfe was racist and that he worked in and was the beneficiary of an organisation with hallmarks of institutional racism. I am satisfied that there is a significant risk that his racism, in combination with some of his other attitudes and values, affected his interactions with the community of Yuendamu on 9 November 2019, his entry into their houses and his perception of and response to the young Aboriginal man he shot and killed in a way that increased the likelihood of a fatal outcome. While it is not possible for me to say with certainty that Mr. Rolfe's racist attitudes were operative in his decisions on 9 November or were a contributing cause of Kumanjai's death, I cannot exclude that possibility. That I cannot exclude that possibility is a tragedy for Kumanjai's family and community, who will always believe that racism played an integral part in his death, and it is a taint that may stain the NT police. This inquest was not the first time racist behaviour has been identified in the NT police. In 2022, the NT Police commissioned Commander Mark Galliot of the Victoria Police to conduct an independent external review of its complaints and discipline systems. Concerning the NT Police, Commander Galliot reported, "It is apparent a person's skin colour can sometimes play a part in the policing response to an issue. The alleged credibility of the complainants and the attitudinal behaviour of some police members. This is not a blanket observation. The review also observed excellent work in remote and other communities." He said, "It is apparent that in some cases, The veracity of a complaint or issue may be measured by who made it, rather than assessing the issue itself. In some cases, the use of derogatory terms as part of everyday language or labelling sections of the Aboriginal policing workforce in a particular way is, quite simply, interpersonal racism. At the time of his report, Commander Galliot understood that other forums will conduct an in-depth analysis on alleged organisational and systemic racism. But to my knowledge, there is currently no plan for any in-depth independent inquiry into racism in the NT Police. Sadly, the findings of the Galliot report, that the credibility of complaints and complainants is sometimes determined by skin colour, rang true with the evidence in this inquest, in the way complaints made by Aboriginal persons against Mr. Rolfe were mishandled by the NT Police. By the middle of 2019, the NT Police force was on notice that Mr. Rolfe needed closer supervision, as multiple complaints had been made on behalf of Aboriginal arrest targets that he had used excessive force, sometimes causing head injuries. And these complaints were, or ought to have been, under investigation. In addition, on several occasions he had been given remedial advice for failing to activate his body-worn video during some arrests. It should have been obvious that action was required to minimise the potential risk to the public posed by Mr. Rolfe. However, in the absence of appropriate oversight, Mr. Rolfe's tactics were tacitly and sometimes expressly approved. The failure of NT Police to properly supervise Mr. Rolfe or to rein him in contributed to a sense of impunity with which he approached his work as a police officer and emboldened his approach. Considering the evidence concerning his use of force, I was satisfied that on at least 5 occasions Mr. Rolfe used a level of force that was unnecessary. I have concerns about the force used on a further 2 occasions, and there were other instances where I was satisfied that the use of force was avoidable. There were instances where Mr. Rolfe used force without proper regard for the risk of injury to persons, all of whom were Aboriginal boys or men, and significant injuries were caused to suspects because of his use of force. When this evidence is considered, together with the contempt Mr. Rolfe showed for the hands-off approach of Officers Hand and Smith on the 6th of November 2019, it points to Mr. Rolfe prioritising a show of force over potential peaceful resolutions. Mr. Rolfe had a tendency to rush into situations to get his man without regard for his and others' safety and in disregard of his training. He had a tendency to seek out situations in which force would be necessary because he found combat situations exhilarating and had an interest in adrenaline-style policing. These occasions were inconsistent with the 10 operational safety principles. The failed arrest of Kumanjai on 9 November was an exemplar of the failure to implement the 10 operational safety principles and a classic example of these tendencies. In disturbing evidence, on at least 5 occasions, Mr. Rolfe recorded on his phone body-worn footage of his forceful arrests of Aboriginal men. He replayed the body-worn video to colleagues and forwarded the phone footage to family and friends. It is clear that a significant motivation for doing this was because he was proud of, was boasting about, and wished to be celebrated for his physical feats of tactical skill or ability. He thought that using force against arrest targets and causing them serious injury was funny. That he videoed, shared and derived enjoyment from his use of force is evidence of the extent of his dehumanisation of suspects, which may have led him into error on 9 November 2019. An officer who dehumanises and devalues the lives of arrestees may be less inclined to do everything necessary to avoid injuring them. He may be more inclined to rush in without regard for suspects, his or others' safety. He might be insufficiently risk-averse. That was the effect of the evidence as to how Mr. Rolfe communicated about and treated numerous suspects he came to arrest, and it is relevant to my assessment of his actions on 9 November 2019. The real failures on 9 November 2019 occurred in the lead up to Mr. Rolfe's entry into House 511 and in the way he approached Kumanjai once inside the house. Mr. Rolfe's conduct was in keeping with what I have found to be his tendencies to rush into situations without regard for the consequences of his actions, to prioritise getting his man above other considerations like safety, and his attraction to adrenaline-style policing. In addition, his interactions with Sergeant Frost and his disregard for the arrest plan are in keeping with his demonstrated lack of discipline and his contempt for authority, bush cops and women. Kumanjai's death in Yuendamu on 9 November 2019 was avoidable. Although in some significant respects the failures were institutional, I share the view expressed by the use of force experts and several highly experienced senior police officers who said that this was a case of officer-induced jeopardy, an expression that describes situations where officers needlessly put themselves in danger, making themselves and others vulnerable and creating a situation that justifies the use of deadly force. On 9 November 2019, Mr. Rolfe, a very junior officer, made a series of flawed decisions that significantly increased the risk of a fatal interaction with a member of the public. Mr. Rolfe did not prioritise safety in the arrest of a vulnerable teenager like Kumanjai. Kumanjai had a history of trauma and poor impulse control and had, just 3 days earlier, wielded a small axe and run in the direction of 2 Yuendamu community police officers to avoid being arrested. That event alone put Northern Territory Police, including Mr. Rolfe and his fellow officers, on notice that there needed to be a carefully planned arrest to avoid repeating that situation. By the late afternoon of 9 November, an ops order or arrest plan had been prepared by Sergeant Julie Frost, the officer in charge of Yuendamu Police Station, and approved by a superintendent. According to that plan, at 5 a.m. the next day, the immediate response team officers were to join a local community police officer who was familiar with Kumanjai and his family. The team were then to travel to the houses Kumanjai stayed at to attempt to arrest him when it was likely he would be sleeping. While the 5 a.m. arrest plan was not guaranteed to work, it was designed to minimise risk. Mr. Rolfe was aware of the written arrest plan, since he and his IRT colleague Constable Kirstenfeld were provided a copy when they arrived at Yuendamu and were briefed on it by Sergeant Frost. But Mr. Rolfe ignored the plan. Mr. Rolfe thought he knew better than Sergeant Frost, a female bush cop. He thought he was fitter and faster than bush cops like Constables Hand and Smith. When all the IR team arrived, Mr. Rolfe briefed them that they were to head out of the station and move straight to the houses Kumanjai was known to reside at, to grab up Kumanjai straight away. This was not, as Mr. Rolfe asserted, intelligence or intel gathering. Instead, it subverted the 5 a.m. arrest plan and substituted it with a hasty venture into the community to, in his words, grab up Kumanjai. Inside House 511, Mr. Rolfe and Constable Eberl immediately located Kumanjai in the small and dark main living area. As they had never previously met him, they could not be sure of his identity, so they approached him and asked his name. Kumanjai lied and said his name was Vernon Dixon. Mr. Rolfe told him to "Just come over here for a sec," and held Kumanjai's arm while he guided him to the side of the room against the wall. Mr. Rolfe, ignoring his training on minimising risk and seemingly with no regard for the alerts on Kumanjai's history or the events of 6 November, placed himself close to the front of Kumanjai in a position where he could not clearly see Kumanjai's hands. He used one hand to hold his phone close to Kumanjai's head so as to compare a photo of Kumanjai with the man in front of him. In doing so, he left part of his body exposed while he was trying to make a positive identification. When he believed he'd made the identification, Mr. Rolfe told Kumanjai to place his hands behind his back. Kumanjai reacted immediately and began to struggle. He took a small pair of scissors from his pocket and moved in a downward striking stabbing motion towards Mr. Rolfe. It appears that Mr. Rolfe blocked the strike with his left arm, and the blow landed on his left shoulder, which caused a minor penetrating injury of the collarbone. In response to Kumanjai beginning to struggle, Constable First Class Ebel said, "Stop it, mate," and used a distraction strike to the side of the face of Kumanjai so that he would stop fighting, and so Constable First Class Ebel could grab his arm. Mr. Rolfe stepped back, removed his Glock 40 caliber pistol from his holster and without warning fired one round into Kumanjai's back. After the first shot, both Kumanjai and Constable Ebel fell to the ground, and Constable Ebel was on top of Kumanjai. Mr. Rolfe then moved forward and fired 2 more rounds into the chest of Kumanjai at close range, while Kumanjai was beneath Constable Ebel. Kumanjai continued to struggle for a brief period and was then handcuffed before the scissors were removed from his right hand. The entire incident was captured on the body-worn video of the involved officers. The first shot was fired at 7:22:01 p.m, the second at 7:22:03, and the third at 7:22:04. At no time did Mr. Rolfe issue a standard warning prior to discharging his Glock pistol. 2 of the 3 gunshots passed through major organs, and a little over an hour later, Kumanjai passed away from his wounds. In accordance with the Coroner's Act, I am not permitted to make any finding that suggests Mr. Rolfe or any other person is guilty of a criminal offence. Further, I must not make any finding or finding that undermines the jury verdict that Mr. Rolfe was not guilty in relation to discharging the second and third shots and which killed Kumanjai in House 511. Many of the issues considered in the inquest were first identified in the original coronial memoranda drafted by the highly experienced officers in charge of the coronial investigation, Detective Superintendent Scott Pollock and his successor, Commander David Proctor. For example, they identified as relevant to the inquest Mr. Rolfe's apparent lack of honesty during his recruitment to NT Police, gaps in the training and procedures of the IRT, Mr. Rolfe's use of force history, the failure of some supervisors to properly review use of force entries such that bad behaviour was effectively condoned, and the lack of an appropriate managerial response to the multiple complaints made about Mr. Rolfe's use of force by mid-2019. Further, they raised the militarisation of the Northern Territory Police Force and the appropriateness of decisions made by police on the ground in Yuendumu in the immediate aftermath of Kumanjai's death. However, neither Detective Superintendent Pollock nor Commander Proctor reviewed the content of Mr. Rolfe's text messages, and nor were they aware that he recorded and disseminated body-worn video footage from some of his uses of force. The text messages and those recordings provided additional significant evidence for the inquest. I have divided my findings into 12 broad chapter headings that reflect the scope of the inquest. Chapter 1, Policing in the NT, includes a consideration of the evolution of the Alice Springs Immediate Response Team and whether there has been a paramilitarisation of the NT Police. It considers racism in the NT Police Force more generally and why racist attitudes might develop. Concerning the question of paramilitarisation, while I accept that there are risks and there is evidence that Mr. Rolfe behaved in a way that was similar to a military-style clearing of the house, and that long arms were openly carried. I'm not able to conclude from that limited evidence that there has been a militarisation of the force as a whole. However, I agree with NT Police that the conversation about militarisation is worthwhile, given the increasing number of recruits who come from the military, and it's encouraging to hear that a new training session has been implemented for police recruits, which emphasises the differences between use of force in occupations such as military as compared to policing. The efficacy of that training should be subject to review. In Chapter 2, I outline the background of Kumanjai Walker. At the beginning of these short remarks, I briefly reflected on the importance of this evidence. It assisted me to better understand why Kumanjai may have acted in the way he did. In order to minimise the risk of fatal conflict in the future, culturally appropriate and sufficiently intensive supports and interventions are required to firstly prevent or minimise exposure to developmental harms, and second, to respond to and support young people who have already been damaged by exposure to harm. Chapter 3 addresses the background of Mr. Rolfe, including his dishonesty during his recruitment to the NT Police and how that is relevant to an assessment of his credibility. Evidence of Mr. Rolfe's declining mental health and his joining and participation in the IRT. Further, I have set out relevant text exchanges that reveal sexist and/or contemptuous attitudes towards some of his fellow officers, specifically bush police and female officers, and a contempt for the system of police accountability, which includes body-worn video and oversight mechanisms, and also racism. Chapter 4 considers the previous incidents of use of force that reveal Mr. Rolfe's tendency to rush in, a history of him focusing on and deriving satisfaction from his use of force. It also considers the failure of systems designed to safeguard the public from inappropriate use of force, including a breakdown of mentoring by 2 key sergeants, a failure to properly scrutinise use of force reports, and the failure of senior management to act on multiple complaints of excessive force causing head injuries, and a finding made by a judge at the local court that Mr. Rolfe had assaulted an Aboriginal male and lied about it in court. In Chapter 5, I considered the lead up to the events of 9 November 2019, including the Axe incident on 6 November, the strain on police and health services at Yuendamu, including from break-ins at the nurses' houses, and the way in which that contributed to the decision to call out the IRT. Chapter 6 addresses the deployment of the IRT on 9 November and considers the deficiencies in IRT policies and procedures and lessons to be learned from a breakdown in communicating parts of the deployment and arrest plan. The IRT members who were dispatched to Yuendamu were picked at random by an acting sergeant, and Mr. Rolfe was tasked to tell the others about the deployment. In the vacuum created by the absence of a formal requirement in the IRT standard operating procedure for a team leader to be appointed, Mr. Rolfe assumed a de facto leadership role and conducted the first briefing for the IRT in the Alice Springs police station. Mr. Rolfe's early adoption of a leadership role for the deployment to Yuendamu likely had an important impact on the team dynamic and his own behaviour, and explains, at least in part, why he assumed a de facto leadership role after the IRT arrived at Yuendamu. In Chapter 7, I consider the 5 a.m. arrest plan, including the briefing of Mr. Rolfe and members of the IRT on that plan. Events moved quickly on the afternoon of 9 November, and by the time the 4 IRT members set out on their drive to Yuendamu, Sergeant Frost was still in the process of finalising the operations order or arrest plan that was intended to govern their actions. The IRT members were told to expect a briefing from Sergeant Frost when they arrived, but their staggered arrivals and the conduct of Mr. Rolfe and Constable Kirstenfeld, who arrived in community first and met with Sergeant Frost before the other IRT members, muddied the waters of the subsequent briefing given by Sergeant Frost. That sequence of events significantly contributed to the communication breakdown between Sergeant Frost and the IRT as a complete team. Having carefully considered all the evidence, I am comfortably satisfied that Sergeant Frost briefed Mr. Rolfe and Constable Kirstenfeld on the 5 a.m. arrest plan and provided them with copies of the ops order arrest plan with the reasonable expectation that they would read it. In coming to this finding, I was assisted by the objective evidence which supported Sergeant Frost on this issue, including the CCTV footage from the Yuendamu police station, which shows Constable Kirstenfeld holding what I found to be was the arrest plan ops order, and the photograph of part of the arrest plan ops order found on Mr. Rolfe's phone. While the 5 a.m. plan was not without its weaknesses, it was a tried and tested approach that police officers were expected to understand. The senior police involved in the development of the plan never anticipated that Mr. Rolfe would jettison the plan and substitute his own vastly inferior approach. Chapter 8 considers the flawed arrest and the killing of Kumanjai. As already briefly discussed, instead of following the arrest plan, Mr. Rolfe, as de facto team leader, substituted his own approach, which was to grab up Kumanjai immediately and led the IRT straight out of the Yuendamu police station and over to the two houses that were suspected to be the places where Kumanjai was staying. When he made that decision, Mr. Rolfe did not follow his training in the 10 operational safety principles, and he did not do his own planning or risk assessment. The upshot of this approach was a stark example of officer-induced jeopardy. Chapter 9 addresses the immediate aftermath of the shooting, including the first aid for Kumanjai and his evacuation from the community. Understandably, members of Kumanjai's family were extremely upset that after he was shot, police dragged him to one of the police vehicles. This was the last time his family saw Kumanjai alive. Members of the IRT explained that they did not mean any disrespect in dragging Kumanjai, and they did so for safety reasons and to render first aid. However, dragging is a disrespectful act. It should not have happened. The first aid that was provided in the police station was of a high standard given the facilities available. Accepting, in a best case scenario, that there may have been a possible window for survival if the clinic had remained open and the nurses were sufficiently skilled. Any chance of Kumanjai's survival was also dependent on a best case retrieval flight scenario. This was not achieved on the night Kumanjai passed away. The retrieval flight was still in Alice Springs when he passed. In those circumstances, even if the clinic had remained open, there was no possibility of his survival. I acknowledge the effect of this terrible night on senior ACPO Derek Williams, and I commend his efforts to maintain peace and prevent unrest within the community on that night and also in the years that have followed. Warren Williams, a respected elder, stood beside his son. The Williams men were assisted by Mr. N, who has sadly since passed away, and by Ned Jampajinga Hargraves. I acknowledge Samara Fernandez Brown and her mother, who provided support to community members while they attempted to find out from police what was going on. Kumanjai's family's worst fears were realised when the message of Kumanjai's passing was finally received. Their distress and trauma was compounded when they later learned that the NT police kept his death a secret while they conducted a ruse on the community, which led his family to mistakenly believe Kumanjai was still alive and evacuated to Alice Springs. Chapter 10 considers some aspects of the coronial investigation, including potential contamination of key witness accounts, the absence of a formal debriefing process, the absence of drug testing for an involved officer, and the confusion caused by concurrent criminal and coronial investigations. In every jurisdiction around Australia other than the Northern Territory, police are required to submit to drug and alcohol testing following the discharge of a firearm. The NT remains an outlier in not requiring such testing to take place. This was a live issue given Mr. Rolfe's demonstrated history of recreational drug use and his recent use of prescribed medication. The consequence is that while there is no evidence to suggest that Mr. Rolfe was adversely affected by any substance, there is also no objective evidence that he was not. In Chapter 11, I consider the closure of the Yuendamu Clinic and the decision to remove Cardia or non-Aboriginal staff before the IRT were deployed. In the days leading up to 9 November, clinic staff in Yuendamu were the victims of an increase in objectively serious property crime, including break-ins to their houses. They were tired and many were frightened. NT Health decided to evacuate the nurses and all other Cardia staff. After Kumanjai was shot, the fact that there was no operational local health clinic to treat him exacerbated the trauma. NT Health acknowledged that there were flaws in the decision-making process concerning the temporary withdrawal of clinic staff and told me what they've done to improve their approach. However, I'm not critical of the decision to withdraw staff given the threats to their safety. Despite the suspicion of some members of the community, there was no collusion or pre-planning between NT Health and NT Police concerning the withdrawal of clinic staff from Yuendamu. To the contrary, there was a lack of communication between Health and Police and little awareness about what the other was doing in response to the apparently targeted break-ins. In Chapter 12, I focus on death prevention. It includes a summary of changes introduced since Kumanjai's death and my coronial recommendations. The process of identifying and responding to issues that emerged from the events of 9 November 2019 began well before the commencement of the inquest, and I acknowledge that NT Police, NT Health and other institutions have already taken significant measures to reform processes and procedures or improve culture. However, as the NT Police conceded, there remains further work to be done. I will now briefly mention just some of the 32 recommendations I have made. Concerning Yuendamu, I have recommended there be additional engagement with and supports for Yuendamu Night Patrol, youth services, disability services, mediators such as the Southern Tanami Kurdaji and on-country rehabilitation and other programs. I have also recommended consultation on whether there is a broad support for the Paramparu proposal for a Yuendamu leadership group. To NT Police, I have recommended that the problems with their management of complaints and internal investigations be addressed in consultation with the Cultural Reform Command, that its anti-racism strategy be strengthened, be targeted, made public, and compliance with its measures be publicly reported. I have recommended that the NT Police engage directly with the Yuendamu leadership groups to develop mutual respect agreements, including when it would be appropriate for police not to carry firearms in community, and I have made other recommendations concerning the use of long-arm weapons. I have made recommendations on recruit training and cultural inductions. Specifically, I have recommended that the circumstances of Kumanjai's death be incorporated in training on officer-induced jeopardy. To NT Health, in an effort to both prevent and address trauma experienced by young people like Kumanjai, I have recommended a strengthening of its developmental screening programs for children under 5 years. To strengthen relationships and the cultural competency of clinics, I have recommended that work be done with the local health advisory groups and other community groups. And I have recommended a strategy be developed for the delivery of sustainable mental health services in Central Australia, including in Yuendamu. I express my profound and sincere thanks to all the council and instructing teams who appeared for the numerous interested parties. The expertise, care and time taken to grapple with an extensive brief of evidence, the confronting and complex factual issues, cross-cultural issues and the emerging legal issues was exceptional. Your comprehensive and concisely distilled submissions were of great assistance. I recognise that all of you took considerable time away from family, friends and busy practices to generously devote yourselves to the work of this inquest, and I am grateful. Your contribution has been invaluable. To the counsel assisting team, Dr. Peggy Dwyer, Senior Counsel, Mr. Patrick Coleridge and Ms. Maria Walls, it's not possible to quantify the personal effort each of you expended to identify and investigate relevant issues and ensure that this inquest received comprehensive, thorough and considered evidence across those issues. I recognise and commend the care you took to ensure, as best as could be accommodated, that the proceedings were culturally respectful and inclusive of Kumanjai's family and wider community. I acknowledge a debt of gratitude for your tenacious and tireless efforts and expert contributions. I thank each of you. I could not have been better assisted. To Kumanjai's family and to the community of Yuendamu, I am sorry for your profound loss. I now hand down my findings.
Got it under